Here, so many people interested in libertarian ideas, and that's our goal. As INESS, we would like to organize irregular discussion clubs on topics interesting for libertarians, or libertarian topics, or discussion clubs interesting for anyone who is interested in ideas concerned of libertarianism or economy. And today's program, we are very happy to welcome Mr. Sean Gabb from Libertarian Alliance, who will have the lecture on ruling class. After having this lecture, we will have the circle of questions. Everybody can ask one or two questions, then Mr. Gabb will answer each one independently. And after that, the discussion will be free. I'm happy that the whole discussion will be in English, because we have visitors from abroad, from Austria, from Eastern Slovakia. I hope the discussion will be fruitful, and we will soon meet on other meeting as well. So, Mr. Gabb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to have been invited here this evening, and I'll start by saying a few things. The first is that I could talk for 3 or 4 hours about this subject, and I won't. So I will try to limit myself to 15, maybe 20 minutes. The second thing I would say is a word of advice. Now, I've brought a video Capitalistic, which may sound rather vague, rather pretentious. However, over the past 30 years that I've been involved in the libertarian movement, I have attended so many discussions. Some of them have gone nowhere, some of them have been embarrassingly bad, but some of them have been very good. And until recently, we had these discussions, and we'd sit around and say, that was wrong, isn't it? And then 6 weeks later, it was wrong. Unless you get a written, text out of the speech. And about 5 years ago, I decided that you must record everything. It may turn out to be very bad, in which case you write it. But if it's good, it's there, you put it on the internet. If it is not on tape, it didn't happen. And remember, we do not have privileged access to the media. We are a fringe movement. Now, we do get on television. I get on television quite a lot of these days. I get the occasional newspaper article published in places like the Times and the Daily Telegraph. But it's not every day, it's not every week. And so we must create our own media, and we must put everything up on the internet. And so, as I said, if it is not recorded, it really didn't happen. Let's hope that this is one that is worth keeping to go on the internet. Okay, I've been asked to talk about libertarian class theories, and I'll begin by saying what I think is the case. There is a ruling class, and this ruling class is made up of a number of interest groups. You have politicians, obviously, civil servants. You have therapists, doctors, psychiatrists, medical bureaucrats. You have educators, university lecturers, school teachers, again, educational bureaucrats. You have media people. You have associated business interests. Now, these are the ruling class. They rule. They are oppressive in various ways, and they are parasitic. Sometimes they're more oppressive than parasitic. Our own ruling class is rather more parasitic than oppressive, but they are both parasitic and oppressive. And they maintain their power not by force, though force does come into it. They maintain their power through ideas, by putting out what is called a legitimizing ideology. That is a set of beliefs, a set of habits of thought that justify the existence and the activities of this ruling class. Sometimes this legitimizing ideology is so strong, it is so universally accepted, that it becomes what is called a discourse. It becomes a way of thinking so powerful that it is almost impossible for ordinary people to think of any other way of looking at the world. Now, when that happens, you have a ruling class which is absolutely secure. You can see this not by looking at current legitimizing ideologies, because we are like a fish in water with the current legitimizing ideology. You're sometimes aware of it, but it's around you. It is so universally present that most of the time you don't even notice it. But you will see if you look into the past at the legitimizing ideologies. The divine right of kings, the idea that we were ordered by God to regard the king as a person of the utmost importance, and that we should at all times obey his will. Now, when you look at the idea that the divine right of kings ideology, you ask yourself, how did we believe that nonsense? But they did. Or if you look at some of the legitimizing activities of the ruling class in the past, you must obey the church, you must obey the government, otherwise the world will come to an end. That sounds rather like today, actually. If you don't do as the government says, if you don't switch off your air conditioning, and if you don't have wind towers everywhere, sea levels will rise 10 foot by next Tuesday, and the planet will turn into another Venus. Yes, that's a rather strange legitimizing ideology, but it is an important one which appears to work. Most people will accept that one. But in the past, hunting out heresy, punishing witches, making sure that people went to church or went to the right church at the right times. Those are all parts of legitimizing ideologies. They keep the power and status of the ruling class discussed. Politicians, bureaucrats, therapists, educators, media people, and associated business interests. So that is what I believe is the case. I think it is important for libertarians to accept that there is a ruling class, or that there are ruling classes, because otherwise we shall never succeed. So many of us assume that the world is ruled purely by ideas. And if you want to spread libertarianism, all you need to do is go out, talk to people, meetings like this, or get into the newspapers. You just persuade people. Life would be so much better if we did not have a government taxing us and telling us what to do. And you sometimes find that you can make people accept that for 5 or 10 minutes, and then it doesn't work. It seems that our propaganda outreach is not always very successful. We know with burning conviction that life would be better if we had a smaller government or no government at all. But we do not seem able to make other people accept that truth. And one of the reasons why we are so unsuccessful at this is that we don't realize the power of the vested intellectual and corporate interests which keep people believing in these rather strange and manifestly false legitimizing ideologies. So that is what I believe to be the case. Now, there are two very big objections to my belief. The first is that all this talk of a ruling class sounds rather Marxist. And yes, it does sound Marxist. Indeed, I have used Marxist terminology, legitimizing ideology, discourse, hegemonic discourse. You may not find these in the works of the classical Marxists, but you'll certainly find them in the works of the neo-Marxists, people like Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, and so on. And yes, I am deliberately using Marxist terminology because I am explaining ideas which have been most fully developed by Marxist philosophers. But I'll come to that in a moment. The second objection is what is called the logic of collective action. I'm saying that many people regard themselves as members of a class, and they do. But we know that people have interests both as members of a group and as individuals. And we know from our study of economics, the study of cartels, for example, that if you have to choose between your class interest and your personal interest, you will, in most cases, classes follow your personal interests. And so, why should we believe that a ruling class has any value as a concept? Surely people always follow their individual interests. They may give some nodding obedience to the idea of a class interest, but they will follow their personal interest at all times. Those are the two objections. My answers are as follows. With regard to the Marxist accusation, yes. I am using Marxist terminology because, as I said, the Marxists have developed the idea of a ruling class most fully. But class theory is not purely Marxist. Indeed, Marx borrowed much of class theory from liberals. Class theory is, in its origins, far more liberal than it is socialist. You have French liberals like Charles Comte, Baldwin, Augustin Thierry. You have English classical liberals like Cobden and Bright and Herbert Spencer, and even John Stuart Mill. They were fully aware of the idea of a ruling class. They knew that they were facing a solid wall of opposition to liberal ideas, and they were quite good at analysing class. However, during the last 150 years, we, for various reasons, we liberals, libertarians, have stopped thinking very much about class, and the Marxists did a great deal more work than we ever did. And so we used their ideas where appropriate. And I don't feel at all embarrassed about using Marxist ideas. It's a bit like saying you shouldn't drive on motorways because the first person to build motorways on a large scale was Adolf Hitler. Or you shouldn't use radar because radar was developed by governments as an instrument of war. No, you use whatever is available, regardless of who developed it. And where the Marxists are right, we should simply accept that. Now, there is an important difference, however, between Marxist or socialist class analysis and liberal class analysis. And the important difference is where is the source of class power? For the Marxists, as I understand it, and I'm speaking to people who may know rather more about Marxism than I do, but as I understand it, the Marxist idea of class power is that it is located in ownership of the means of production. For Marx, following Rousseau, you begin with a state of primitive communism in which there is no private property and there is no state and everyone is happy and so on. And then you have a group of people who appropriate the means of production to themselves, the land or whatever. And these people become enormously rich and they become powerful and they then set up a state which is the executive committee of the ruling class. Now, as time goes by, different class interests emerge because of changes in the means of production, and you have a series of revolutions in which one new class takes over the state from the old class. And so you have ancient slave societies based on ownership of people. You then have the feudal system based on ownership of land, and then capitalism emerging in the 18th century based on the ownership of capital. So that is the Marxist theory of class. And of course it follows from that because the source of class power is in ownership of the means of production, it doesn't matter after the socialist revolution how much power the state has. Once you take away class power from the state, it becomes a neutral institution which can then be used to achieve the classless socialist society. And so, in the Marxist scheme of things, after a revolution, you do not need constitutional guarantees of due process or constitutional protections of freedom of speech, because there is no danger. The state stops being dangerous the moment you take it, the moment you remove class power. Now that is an absurd theory, and I don't need to say anything more about that. It is manifestly absurd. We know that. Let me just go on to what liberal class is. For us, the source of class power is the state itself. It is the state that enables class oppression. The state is something that exists. It is then taken over by people who may be already rich, but who certainly want to become rich or richer through their possession of the powers of the state. It is through the state that these people are able to regulate markets so that they win any battle of competition. It is through the state that they're able to regulate our lifestyle. It is through the state that they're able to censor the press and make sure that we are brought up to believe in these legitimizing ideologies. If you take away the state, the whole basis of class power falls to the ground. There can be no more parasitism, there can be no more oppression. And so that is the fundamental difference between libertarian and Marxist class theory. We can use the same tools of analysis, discourse theory, legitimizing ideologies, and so on. But we must bear in mind that the difference is, for the Marxists, class power lies in ownership of the means of production. For us, it lies in ability to manipulate the institutions of the state. Take away the state, and there can be no class oppression. Take away the state, and there can be no ruling class. It will not be a perfect society, because rich people will always tend to stick together, and they will always tend to find some way to rig markets in their own interests. But without the state to support their activities, they really will need to offer their services in a reasonably free market, and well, you will not have these giant privileged corporations, you will not have these giant bureaucracies, you will not have this omnipresent thing standing above us, telling us how to live, and in many cases, how long to live. So that is the first answer to the objection to my claim that there is a ruling class. Now the second, my second answer, or my answer to the second objection, is rather hard. As I said, some libertarians, David Friedman, for example, deny that there is such a thing as a ruling class. There may have been a ruling class in early modern times, when you could have 500 or 600 people in a country. These people were often related to each other, they had the same education, they dressed in the same way, they smelt different from ordinary people, they regarded themselves as gentlemen or persons of quality, persons of gentility. The English language is filled with expressions of class difference, which date back to the 16th and 17th century, even earlier. Now, you could perhaps have a ruling class then. But nowadays, in a country even like Slovakia, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people who could be regarded as members of the ruling class. And when you have a ruling class that size, surely the whole concept becomes worthless. Now, what is the answer to that? And the answer is not as simple as my answer to the first one. But what I would say is this. The argument from a logical collective action is not as powerful as many people believe. We know that people regard themselves as members of a nation or a race, and they are so obsessed with this idea of belonging to a particular nation that they'll let themselves be put into uniforms and sent off to be killed in wars. They'll watch their children be taken from them, put into uniform and sent off to die in wars. And these people will turn up afterwards to the war memorial and put flowers and believe that it was all for a good cause. There is an answer to the argument from the logic of collective action. People do think of themselves as members of a nationality, and they will put national interest, however bizarre it may be, before personal interest. And people will do the same with class interest. It depends on the power of the legitimizing ideology. And on the point of legitimizing ideology, I will say this. A legitimizing ideology is not a set of lines, a set of conscious lines that a ruling class makes up and imposes on everybody else. a legitimizing ideology is something that is believed as much by the ruling class as by everybody else. Indeed, it is when a ruling class stops believing in its legitimizing ideology that it becomes weak and you can predict a revolution. In 1784, for example, Beaumarchais wrote his Marriage of Figaro, which was turned into a much better opera by Mozart at the time. In the third act of Figaro, there is an exchange between Figaro and the Count. Not in the opera, this is in the French original. Where Figaro says to the Count, look, you have land, you have money, you have status, you have fine clothes, you have everything anyone could ever want. What did you do to earn this? You took the trouble to be born, and that was it. Now there was a straight attack on the old regime in France. And the French censors looked at this and said, can't perform this, you can't perform this at all. And so a number of French aristocrats got together and they had this play put on at the Royal Theatre at Versailles. And they turned up to watch this and they applauded it, and they thought they were ever so clever, ever so modern and enlightened, and perhaps they were. But quite obviously they had ceased to believe in the ideology that justified their position. And no one should be surprised when 5 years later the old regime in France fell to the ground. Equally, here in the 1980s, I don't think your ruling class really believed in orthodox Marxist-Leninism anymore. They derived benefits from the system which had been set up in the 1950s. They didn't really believe in it. And so at the first gust of wind, that system fell to the ground. A legitimizing ideology must be believed by everybody in order to work. And when it is believed by everybody, members of the ruling class, just like everybody else, will make sacrifices for the sake of the greater good. And so a ruling class will stick together, even when it may be in the not in the short-term interests of individual members. Now, continuing with the theme of the ruling class, they do have a number of things in common. They have a set of shared assumptions about the weakness of state power and their own fitness to direct the state. Now they will have arguments. There are big arguments within modern ruling classes, much bigger than the past. For example, the argument of smoking. The revenue collecting arms of states like smoking because it brings a large amount of tax money. The therapeutic arms of the ruling state want to restrict smoking or even to make it illegal. And there is a war going on within the ruling class over smoking and over many other aspects of lifestyle regulation. But these people will never carry their dispute to the point where they destabilize the position of the ruling class as a whole. Roderick Long, a very important left-wing libertarian, describes, he likens this to the dispute in old Europe between church and state. For nearly 1,000 years, church and state in this part of the world was in a struggle for mastery. Who was the most important element in the ruling class? The priests or the nobles? And sometimes they carried their disputes to extreme lengths, but never to the ultimate extreme lengths where they would destabilize the whole order of things. They always knew that they had certain common interests, and their common interest was keeping ordinary people down there, digging in those fields, paying their rent and their tithes. And you'll find that with modern ruling classes. You'll also find that these people have much the same education, and in many cases they are related to each other. I don't know how it is here. Perhaps it might be rather embarrassing if I was to name names. But in England, you have names like Toynbee, you have names like Cecil. In America, names like Roosevelt, Ball. These are members of old families. They have old money, and they still have very strong power. They are often related to each other by marriage and by blood, and they stand together. If you look at England, the country I know best, you'll find that quite often a politician will start working as a public relations executive for a large corporation or for one of the state-favoured charities. He will then move on to positions. He will then move on to a seat in Parliament. He may get into the cabinet. He will then retire to a non-executive position in a company like British Telecom or Marks and Spencer or Tesco. These people move around. People move from the corporate sector into the bureaucratic sector. Bureaucrats quite often, when they retire, move into the corporate sector. It is surprising how many civil servants, how many senior civil servants in the British Ministry of Defence get themselves jobs with British Aerospace, the big British armaments manufacturer, once they've retired. So these people they are part of the ruling class. They move around, and they stand together when it matters. Now, the real difficulty for us as libertarians is that it's not always easy to identify a member of the ruling class. If you're a Marxist, it's simple. This person owns the means of production. This person owns a shoe factory, therefore he is a member of the ruling class. For us, Tesco, the chief executive of Tesco is a member of the ruling class because Tesco is a state-privileged organisation. It has limited liability because you wouldn't have in a purely free market. Tesco benefits from transport subsidies. Look at all those new roads built in this country so that Tesco can move its things around. Tesco hasn't taken on hospitals, no. Tesco is a ruling class organisation. At the same time, however, it is also part of the private free market economy, in the sense that Tesco does provide things that people want. And you'll find this with organisation after organisation and person after person within the ruling class. In modern societies, people are quite often a quarter in the ruling class. They derive a quarter of their position from membership of the ruling class, which allows them to be parasitic and oppressive, and 3/4 of their position, 3/4 of their wealth, from selling things that people want. Is Bill Gates a member of the ruling class? Yes, but Microsoft benefits enormously from intellectual property protection law, which Microsoft in New South Wales has helped to write. At the same time, Microsoft does provide us with very wonderful software, which has made our lives so much easier. And I have been quite willing to give money to Bill Gates to buy the software, and I've even thought it money well spent. So it's not easy for us, as it was for the Marxists, to identify members of the ruling class, but I would say at the end that it is still a very important concept for us to consider, because if we want to win the battle of ideas, if we want the 21st century, if we want the second half of the 21st century to be more libertarian than the first half, and more libertarian than the 20th century was, we do need to consider the obstacles to the progress of libertarian ideas, and one of the most important obstacles is a ruling class which is not interested in libertarian ideas. So I could speak about this for a long time. I've spoken for a while. I'll stop now, and I'll thank you for your patience. Thank you.
So now there is a time for your questions. So are there any questions? Okay, let's start with Mike.
Hi, Sean.
Hi, Mike.
I'm curious what your thought is in setting up the libertarian class theory. You kind of developed a two-way split, the ruling class and everyone else. One of the features of Marxist class theory was that you had the capitalists as the ruling class, with the workers as the oppressed potential revolutionaries, and the bourgeoisie sitting in the middle as a group which could choose to throw their allegiance one way or the other. Is there a parallel that you can draw to add to libertarian class theory?
Well, yes, I mean, that does broadly describe our own theory. It's just that it is so much less neat than Marxist. Because as I said, if you're a Marxist, The owner of this place is a member of the ruling class because he owns the means of production. And if you don't own anything, you are not a member of the ruling class. But without particular class theory, you need to look on a case-by-case basis. Does the owner, is the owner of this place a member of the ruling class? Well, he has to do business with the Bratislava government to get his license and to obey various regulations. He may even sit on the town council, I don't know. But it's not easy. That's the problem. I believe there is a ruling class, but identifying a member of it without uncertainty is not easy. Even Bill Gates, I'm sure you'd agree that he is a member of the ruling class, but it's not as easy.
Well, he's a member of a ruling family also, to some
Yes,
extent.
but he also provides things that are valuable to us that we do pay for.
I don't, but
I won't give you or not.
Okay, next question. I have one. So maybe you said it's difficult to identify somebody that's a member of the ruling class. Is it possible? Do people that are in the ruling class know that they are the ruling class?
That's a good question. I think the answer is yes. It's difficult to identify members of the ruling class, but it's not impossible. And I can point to people in England. The journalist Polly Toynbee, she is a member of the ruling class. She is one of the leading propagandists for the various legitimizing ideologies. Jonathan Dimbleby, the Dimbleby brothers, Jonathan Dimbleby and Richard Dimbleby, big people in the BBC. You can look at maybe 500 or 600 people in England and you can say with pretty sure certainty those are members of the ruling class. You can do the same in America. Although it's a larger country with a slightly more, it's rather more decentralized, but you can still point to them. And in this country, I don't know as well as you do, but you can point to people and say, yes, that person is undeniably a member of the class, and if he does own a company, most of the money comes via the state.
Like the characteristics by which you decide whether he's a member or not, be the consciousness.
Yes.
He's conscious that he's using the state for his own privilege. Because some people use the state but don't know about it. For example, owner of pharmacy is using the state for because all these regulations and stuff, but he's not conscious about this fact. So is he a member of the ruling class or not? That's the question.
Well, the answer must be, and Mike will need to help me, the answer will need to be on his state of class of consciousness. Now, if you are a pharmacist, you can only operate if you have the right piece of paper and if you obey the right regulations. Now, if you are an ordinary pharmacist who simply accepts the world as it is, then you're not a member of the ruling class. If, on the other hand, you're a pharmacist who sits on a committee demanding more and more controls over the number of aspirins people can buy, or insisting on subsidies for anti-smoking patches, then yes, you are a junior member of the ruling class. That's rather a true way of talking about it. If you work for a bank,
That's a hard question.
it depends on your state, it depends on what you think. Do you consciously keep the system, do you consciously move the system forward, or do you simply accept it as it is?
Because my question, like, whether I am a member of the ruling class, because I was working for a bank for a while, so.
Yes. I don't know. I run a limited company. Does that make me a member of the ruling class? I don't think so, but a Marxist would say yes. So it is a much more fuzzy concept, and you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. You can't just say all of those people are members of the ruling class. No, they're not. Some of them are, some of them aren't. if you look at past examples, one of the reasons why accepting there is a ruling class is so important is that it gives you an interesting weapon. In the 1630s in England, whenever Charles I rode by in his carriage, or whenever his ministers rode by, people would stand in the street pointing and shouting, "Privilege, privilege." These were members of the ruling class. Their power was seen as illegitimate, and people increasingly rejected it. In the 1770s and 1780s in France, people recognised that there was a ruling class, its power was illegitimate, and they rejected it. And much the same in this part of the world. You could look at the corrupted classes, you could point at them, and you could tell them, your status within the society is based on oppression, it is illegitimate. Now, it would be very useful if we could do the same, if we could point at people and not just say, your ideas are wrong. Your idea that we need carbon trading permits is actually very harmful. The Cato Institute does good work. I don't say that these are bad people, but the Cato Institute in America seems to operate on the assumption that everybody is basically benevolent. Everybody is of goodwill. It's just that some people believe bad things, and we must simply change their minds. Well, no. Some people believe bad things because it is in their interest to believe those bad things. And it's very easy to point to them and say, you believe this because it is in your interest as a member of the ruling class.
Well, let me defend Cato for a while, because like, we're doing something very similar in Slovakia. maybe it's the strategy of persuading the ruling class that they're believing the wrong things. So maybe, because you mentioned this, well, you mentioned that the ruling class can exist only as long as their own members believe what they're saying. So maybe they are focusing their efforts and their energy on persuading these people that, well, that they are believing bullshit.
Well, that is a valid strategy. It's a valid strategy which I mean, what you can sometimes do is focus your attention on members of the ruling class and persuade them that they will be richer and happier as members of the ruling class if they behave differently. And that seems to work in England for several hundred years. And several hundred years is a long time. Now, it may work. The Cato Institute idea of changing people's minds about specific issues and policies may work. But another strategy is to point at these people, shout privilege, and wait for their moral legitimacy. It depends on circumstances.
Just the response to something you said earlier was, from my perspective, looking at, for example, you or I working in a bank. Well, you know, unless he's the CEO or on the board of directors, then no, probably you're not a member of the ruling class. You may be a tool of the ruling class by virtue of your position working in the bank, and you may in fact receive privileges that flow from the ruling class's exercise of state power. Just as you know, the private or the corporal or even the captain in the army is generally not a member of the ruling class. He's a tool of the establishment. So the question that I like to ask people when we get into this kind of discussion is that if what was required for us to achieve a free society was for you, the person I'm speaking with, to give up whatever privileges you have which flow from the state, would you do it? And this question raises all kinds of issues.
Well, that is an interesting question because one of the things about modern societies is that they are just so enormously wealthy, and it's possible to share the proceeds of plunder around very, very widely. 200 or 300 years ago, ruling classes were very small because there was very limited wealth, and there are all sorts of ways of keeping wealth within the ruling class. Whereas it is possible to scatter it far and wide. Welfare benefits, corporate benefits. I receive certain benefits because I have a higher degree, which gives me the ability to work in British state universities. Now, I receive certain privileges from the ruling class. Indeed, I'm a British citizen, which gives me a large number of privileges. Now, would I give those up in order to achieve a free society? If I really believed that giving my privileges up would result in a free society, yes, I would. But I would need fairly cast iron assurances before I do that.
This is a good answer.
Yes. I mean, you've taken a leap in the dark. You've given up one of the biggest privileges in the world. I admire you for it, but I wouldn't copy it, you see.
Don't you think that the way out is maybe in possibility to break down central power of state, because working class is grouping around states organization, and therefore when you look from beginning of the last century, central power governments were smaller. Maybe they earn from 5 to 30% of GDP by taxes. And now, when you look on EU, in average, government, all governments in EU, 27 governments, they around 48% of GDP, and it's growing up. Therefore, why there is reason for member of ruling class to go out from this group, because they are very close to earn some profit from this privilege, and everything is based on this central democracy rules. Therefore, I think how to find the way out, maybe the way is to break the central power and move the power to small groups, for instance, for villages and so on. What do you think?
Well, when I came into the Libertarian movement 30 years ago, I noticed that there are other people who believe that a free society was 5 years away. And no, the past 30 years I've been meeting these people. They say, if you do this, this, and this, we'll have freedom in 5 years, no problems. And of course, the project is much harder, because we are facing an organised ruling class which is not interested in a free society. At the same time, however, we need to accept that ruling classes do collapse, and they collapse on a very regular basis. In 1789, in 1917, in 1989, ruling classes just suddenly collapsed. A few months earlier, they had appeared to be in total command, and it looked as if it would go on forever and ever and ever. And then it just crumbled, and people had to start again. Now, this does happen, and it may not be a total collapse. We had a little collapse in England in 1974. From about 1940 until 1970, the British ruling class believed that it was possible to maintain full employment and reasonable levels of economic growth by manipulating the money supply in various Keynesian ways that I don't need to discuss. And they believe there was a stable trade-off. If you want fuller employment, you have to go up with higher inflation. And if you want lower inflation, you need to go up with higher unemployment. And then in 1974, we found ourselves in what all the economists said was an impossible situation. Unemployment, 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, and inflation, 25, 30, 35%. They were going up at the same time in the same direction. And I remember watching the television discussion programs where politicians and economists were being asked, so, why is this happening? What can you do about it? And they were asked. The entire system of economic management, which everybody had thought was the latest and most modern thing, fell to the ground. And the politicians looked around for a new way of managing the economy. Now there were two rivals in England in the 1970s. They were the extreme socialists who were saying, this is the final crisis of capitalism, let us now move forward to true socialism. And these people were often very clever, they were committed, they were not all Soviet, they were not all Soviet agents, many of them were, but they weren't all Soviet agents. And on the other side there was the Institute of Economic Affairs, various small groups within the Conservative Party, which had for 30 years been arguing for lower taxes, strict control of the money supply, and privatisation. And these people had been ignored, and when they hadn't been ignored, they'd been laughed at. All through the 1960s, Milton Friedman used to turn up in London, give a lecture in a room like this. And people would say, yes, yes, Professor Friedman, that's absolutely right. And then Milton Friedman would go out, get on the underground, and go back to his hotel, and no one would pay any attention to him. And then suddenly in 1974, these people, the Institute of Economic Affairs, with their stacks of pamphlets, suddenly found themselves in demand. They were on television. They were being taken to lunch by ministers of the Labour government. Their ideas were suddenly very popular. Now, I don't know if the present set of financial and economic crises we're facing will lead to the same collapse of ideology. I don't know. But it is very important for us as libertarians to write, to publish, to argue. We may not have money to print books and leaflets, but we have the internet. And it's very important for us to have our internet publications, our blogs, our discussion forums, because at the moment, let's be honest, no one is paying any attention to us as libertarians. But that may change. There may be a crisis of legitimacy within the ruling class brought on by outside circumstances in which we suddenly find ourselves very important. I mean, it's not as simple as people in England often assume, but look at people like Klaus. In the 1980s, there he was, some little economist working away in the Ministry of something, doing nothing in particular. In 1989, the Czechoslovak communist establishment collapsed, and people looked around, and Klaus said, follow me, and some people did. And, all right, where I come from in England, that's how Klaus is regarded as a little god. We worship him. When Klaus arrives in London, he's followed around by admiring crowds. People who say, thank you, Mr. Klaus, for being that's Klaus. And he likes it because, well, we all know that's Klaus. But the important thing is that Klaus has been a force for good in this part of the world. And what allowed him to be a force for good was that he was there at the right time, in the right place, with the right ideas. He knew what needed to be done. It may not have been entirely right, but he knew what needed to be done, and he was able to convince people. Now, it may be that we shall live our entire lives sitting around in rooms like this, talking to the converted about things which we all agree on. and nothing will ever happen. But it may be that in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, or it may be tomorrow or next Tuesday, there will be another legitimizing, another crisis of legitimacy, and some of you will find yourselves pushed into television studios wearing a suit that is too small for you, and you will find yourselves making the case for freedom in front of journalists and politicians who are for the first time willing to listen. That is what we can do. As I said, most of our activity may be a total waste of time. It may be that you'll pass your entire lives believing in things that nobody else accepts, and you can put it on your gravestone, I was right. Or it may be that in 10 years' time, you will find yourselves in the back of a nice ministerial car, going off to do something that is very useful. You don't know.
I'd like to make 2 points. One is related to the different system of ruling by ruling class, which was allowing the possibility to be elected. The election makes it very difficult for general public to point and say you are privileged, because privileged people say you can be elected as well. This is very complicating our thing. The other point I'd like to have is you've been mentioning backlog clubs. Something hard to say, but think about the way how he got to the point that he can become a voice of Euroscepticism and free market. The question for me, should I follow his road, meaning becoming a ruler of a political party and becoming able to manipulate powers in the Czech Senate so that he can become elected second time? I mean, he came to this position by ruling the ruling party. So should we treat him as a positive example?
Regarding Klaus, there is no one way to a free society, and sometimes you will need politicians. More often, I think you'll need people who simply go out and be free. Do something in the underground economy. Make sure that a free economy grows up underneath the structures of a controlled economy, so that one day it can just grow up and push everything else to one side. Kevin Carson in America is a very big advocate of this. You should create the structures of a free society within the structures of the old, underneath, within, beside, and so on. There's no one way of doing it. But going back to your point about democracy, yes, democracy, is democracy a total sham? Probably not. But it can be a very clever sham. The idea that because the politicians were elected, they therefore have legitimacy. Now, in this country, you have a list system, which means that you don't vote for individuals, you vote for parties. And according to how many votes a party gets, so it appoints deputies. And the person at the top of the list is the first person to be elected. And so your political system is institutionally corrupt. You vote for a party. The party must be registered. It gets funding from the state. It gets privileged access to the media. And then the various people who get elected simply, it's all decided in a smoke-filled room who is at the top of the list. So yes, democracy here is largely a sham. And democracy in England is a sham as well. It's not quite so obviously corrupt, but it's corrupt in different ways. Democracy is a good way of putting a fig leaf over a generally oppressive system. You can say, well, you know, it's not a ruling class, it's not oppressive, because we can throw these people out. Yes. You can vote up this gang of thieves, and another gang of thieves will come in. That being said, some gangs of thieves are more sensible and less parasitic than other gangs of thieves. In England at the moment, we have a totally worthless Labour government reaching the end of its life. It will be replaced by a pretty worthless Conservative government, but the Conservatives will be less worthless than Labour. For at least 2 years, they'll be less worthless. So democracy may not be a total waste of time, but I don't think arguing for more democracy is a way of getting towards a free society. We tried it in the 19th century, and it didn't work. I'm just thinking of Hans Hermann Popper's book, Democracy was all that failed. But it's rather pessimistic, unless he's right.
Next question.
I'm thinking still about how you answered the question about giving up our privileges. And I'm thinking that possibly if you give up your privileges to obtain something like freedom, you can never be a member of the ruling class for long, because there will be always someone who will not be willing to give up his privileges, and they will replace you.
Well, that's rather an optimistic argument, or rather the answer is this. It may be that the kind of free society that we believe is actually impossible, because there will always be organised groups which will find a way of getting control of the state or setting the state up. And so perhaps a more useful strategy will be to hope that one day, in some part of the world, a balance of forces will come into being in which the ruling class voluntarily limits itself. Now that is something that happened in England between the 16th and between the middle of the 17th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. We had a ruling class in England, but it was, for the most part, remarkably liberal. Not because it was filled with nice people, but because this ruling class knew very clearly that if it allowed the state to grow beyond a certain size, the present ruling class will be pushed out by a new ruling class of bureaucrats and business interests. Now it may be that rather than agitating for a total collapse of the state, we should be looking to find some way of moving towards a balanced constitution within which the various interests that rule the state will voluntarily limit themselves. Now that may be utterly utopian, because the English ruling class was pretty liberal for 300 years, and we've had at least 7,000 years of recorded history. And the number of occasions when you've had a liberal ruling class doesn't amount to more than 1% of that at the very most. So I don't know. But at least that did work for a while, whereas what we're suggesting may simply mean pulling down a more or less oppressive parasitic structure so that something much worse can be put in its place. I will write on this later in the year.
I'd like to mention one story which happened 20 years ago on the New York Square during the Global Revolution, when the speakers read the list of the requirements against the communistic regime. And there was, for example, freedom of speech, great applause for the crowd, freedom of religion, great applause for the crowd, and maybe the first one was a legal authority of all forms of ownership. 20 seconds silence in the crowd, and after some applause, and I honestly believe that when somebody, some speaker said what does it really mean to this crowd, that there would be no revolution, and maybe he will be still communism. So I want to ask you, do you think that when we clearly state what do we want, what type of change do we want, that the crowd now in the democracy will support this idea of change?
I don't think the opinion of the crowd is in itself terribly important. So what you can do is you can take this off to a bus queue and you can lecture these people on the need for various kinds of freedom. And you may get them eventually to accept your argument. But half an hour later, they've forgotten this. crowds normally shout slogans that intellectuals have decided on sometime earlier. So most revolutions take place within elites, and the ordinary people just accept it.
Yes, but when you look at the results of the revolution, so in most cases we don't see the more freedom like the result, we can see the less freedom like the result.
Right. All right, let me
So
tell
there is a huge risk.
All right.
Revolution is always a blind, there's a huge risk.
It's a leap in the dark, but let me go back to your point about the legal equality of all ownership. Now, I must say that that doesn't sound... That has a rather suspicious sound about it, I must say. Now, what I'd like to do is put yourself in the position of somebody at the bottom of society. Not as a more or less privileged member of the middle class, which is, let's face it, what we all are. Put yourself at the bottom. And try to think what it was like before communism, before socialism. Think what it was like in England 100 years ago. You are a person at the bottom, you're in your 20s, your teeth are rotting, you've seen 2 of your children die, the one who survived has an unpleasant condition that makes his legs bow like that. Your sister died in childbirth, you're cold in the winter, you smell in the summer. And when you go out in the street, you see these lovely black coaches, shiny wood coaches, pulled by 6 horses, drive by, and through the window you can see men and women, men in tall, shiny hats, and women in beautiful silk dresses. And you are asked then to believe in the legal equality of all forms of ownership. These people who derive their wealth from rents on land which may not morally be theirs, who derive wealth from dividends in companies which are legally privileged by the state. You know, the legal equality of all forms of property. I'm not sure that I would agree with that.
And which have inherited it from the accumulated privileges of
That's
centuries
right,
past.
yes.
But in your case, most probably I would believe in state ownership of everything.
No.
And I would support, for example, Marx.
No. What I would believe is an individual's ability to use his mind and his hands to create wealth, which is his property, and to use that property to make his life and the life of his loved ones better, and to pass that property on to his children. Now that's the property that I regard as legitimate. When you talk about the legal equality of all forms of property, I begin to wonder, what does that mean? Does it mean big accumulations of inherited land? Does it mean the ability to draw rents, or the ability to draw enormous dividend wealth from state-privileged corporations? And I'm wondering if those people in the crowd 20 years ago were completely stupid when they fell silent. They were probably wondering, what does that mean? Does it mean my right to have what I earn and what I make for myself? Or does it mean their right to be rich again at our expense? That's a point that's worth considering. Libertarianism, too often, I would suggest, has been a middle-class doctrine. It's something that, obviously we like it. We like the ability to sit around a room like this, being able to pay for our drink and being able to talk subversion without having the police break in and arrest us. Freedom is wonderful for middle-class people.
This guy's an agent, by the way.
Oh, I will talk to you afterwards. How do you make the case for freedoms of people at the bottom? What's in it for them? And too often we have ignored people at the bottom. And I'm afraid that those intellectuals who 20 years ago were talking about the legal equality of all forms of property were either being rather stupid or perhaps rather dishonest. And as I said, I can sympathise with the people in the crowd who greeted that demand with absolute silence. As I said, I and Mike would want to know what it meant before we assented to it.
with respect to each particular title?
I wouldn't go as far as you and Kevin Carson, but I'm inclined that way.
I don't go as far as Kevin Carson.
No. So if we're trading names, has anyone heard of Kevin Carson? A very interesting American libertarian.
Has anyone ever seen a photo of Kevin Carson?
No. No. Is Kevin Carson a black woman?
We have no idea.
Yes. But Kevin Carson is a left-wing libertarian, and he's interested in promoting libertarianism from the bottom up. And he has no time for big corporations and corporate structures of power. I don't go as far as he does. I think in many respects he's wrong, but he's interesting. And I do know people in England who insist that he's just a communist who talks about free markets as an excuse for bringing back communism. But no, he's not more interested in that. And it's worth doing a Google search on him. I wrote a long review of his one of his books a few weeks ago, which is quite a good review. It's worth covering.
It's a good idea.
Studies in mutualist political economy?
No, organization theory.
Aha.
You should look it up on Amazon. It has a wonderful cover. Sorry, we're wandering on.
May I have one more question?
Yes.
I just
Sorry, we need
sorry,
to-
could go.
Okay, thank you very much.
See you.
When the Germany redoing their lands in 1990s, the first thing the Western Germany company required from new government was to set minimum wage at the level of Western Germany, so that they clear the field in eastern part of Germany, and most of the companies had to close.
Yes.
And I was thinking, let's say that most of these Western Germany companies were not really using the privileges of state, but for this one case, they decided to use it. What can we do to explain or persuade or change their minds as the businessmen not to use these privileges to spread their limited law on the other country? And I was thinking, is it that we can talk to these people whom we can hardly persuade that you can get more wealth because they are already quite wealthy? Is it only that we can stress that the values, like we can, or we can argue just in a moral way, or we can do something else?
Now, I'm not familiar with the case you've given, and so what I would do is I would first of all ask who pushed for the extension of the German minimum wage to Eastern Germany. You may well be right. It may have been German big business which was trying to bankrupt any competition in the East. Indeed, that sounds entirely likely. Now, if that is the case, then what you would do is you would get hold of these people in intelligence studio and say, so in order to increase your profits, you will condemn 15 million people to a lifetime on welfare. Is that what you want? Does profit mean that much? Putting profit before people. Socialist language is often quite useful. You can turn it around and use it against, you can use it against corporate interests. Now, of course, there may have been other interests which wanted the extension of German minimum wages to the East. It may have been, we know that there is bottomless ignorance of economics among most ordinary people. And most East Germans would probably have thought, yes, let's have German minimum wages because then we can all be better off.
And free flying ponies for everyone.
That's right. And so it may have been economic ignorance. It may have been demanded by West German trade unions. It may be that the big business interests in West Germany didn't want this. They wanted nice cheap labour in the East, and it was pushed for by West German trade unions as a way of protecting jobs for their particular members. Before you condemn a particular law that has this effect, it's useful to investigate who is behind it. We know who benefits, but who is pushing for it, and then use the appropriate language. Now, I find it entirely incredible what you said, that big business in West Germany wants to shut down competition and so push for this. And so you shout at them. You are using your privileges to condemn people to the dole. Other ways of doing it would be to find other groups within West German big business which didn't want this, which wanted cheap labour in the East, and to get money from them to raise a campaign. It depends on circumstances. As far as I can remember, this law did go through. East Germany remains effectively a dead zone, and most investment went into the Czech Republic, went into the Czech Republic, which didn't have this law. It's an interesting case, and I will do some reading on that now you mentioned it, because it sounds like a good, clear-cut example of corporate privilege.
May I have a question? You mentioned that if the ruling class loses self-confidence and the belief into the legitimizing ideology, then it signalizes a time for revolution. And in the 20th century, many members of the ruling classes, for example, in America, and I'm sure that in England, the same way, were attracted by Marxism simply for the reason of their guilty conscience. I mean, they have seen they are rich, they had a guilty conscience of that, and they were attracted by Marxism. They became, for example, intellectuals. Many of the socialist or Marxist intellectuals were members of the upper classes. So my question is, can we maybe awaken the self-confidence of the ruling class by convincing them about libertarian ideas? Or at least a substantial part of them?
I think that's a strategy, but though what I've heard in England is that the number of people in the English ruling class who became Marxists can be numbered on the fingers of two hands, really.
Yep.
The socialist takeover in England was not Marxist. It was state socialism. So, about 100 years ago, you had the rise of British socialism. And what British socialism offered was a controlled, regulated market for big business. As long as big business paid its high taxes, and as long as it looked after its workers, it received guarantees from competition. The workers received various healthcare and pension benefits. And that was, those were the interest groups behind the rise of the British socialist corporate state. And the main groups within this derived considerable advantages. The losers were very poor people, unskilled workers, members of the self-employed ruling class, and of course members of the old landowning class. The influence that Marxism had on England was absolutely minimal. Never more than a few hundred people at most. The Communist Party managed to get 2 members elected to Parliament in 1945, which was a very unusual general election just after World War. And that was it. That was the high point of their influence. They had much influence within some parts of the trade union movement, though probably not as much as my friends would have claimed. But going back to a general point, is it possible to get hold of members of the ruling class and to persuade them to change their minds? Yes, yes.
Because there is one person, the current member of the Rockefeller family. I think he is 80 years old, and he was trained by Joseph Schumpeter and F.A. Hayek. But on the other hand, he is considered as a role model for a ruling class member, as you have put it, because he is regarded as one of the co-owners of the Federal Reserve. So it is a question, therefore I ask this question, if maybe members of the ruling class can appreciate your ideas.
Yes, of course they can, and when that happens, it's very useful. And we should keep on we should keep looking for rich, influential people who are open to persuasion.
And drug them. I'm sorry, I didn't say that.
But you know, these things, when they do happen, are very important. But it doesn't happen very often. Of course, if we could get hold of Bill Gates and turn him into a radical free market libertarian, then you might change history. Unfortunately, Bill Gates has decided to spend all his money on eradicating AIDS or malaria or climate change or something. But yes, you know, every so often we get lucky.
I would like to argue a little bit about this interpretation. I would think about the possibility that it wasn't actually a way how they tried to make the competition to go bankrupt, but it was about surviving on the market. Because you know, if it would have been a free market, I don't think the Western companies would have been able to compete with the Eastern ones. So I'm not arguing about whether it was a misuse or it wasn't. It absolutely was. My question is whether it wasn't used for surviving instead of competing on the market wrong way.
Well, you should think about Eastern Germany in the same way as in Slovakia. Most of the companies, productive companies, were not in really good shape. So I don't really think that, well, I think that German, in my point of view, Western German companies were afraid that somebody else would buy the assets and try to restructure it and then start a competition. But it may, I don't know the reason, as Mr. Gabb said, that it was pressure from trade unions or from the owners of Western German businesses. But
I mean, the argument that West German industrialists were pushing for this war is new to me. I mean, what was prominent at the time was the saying of the Eastern Germans that if the mark doesn't come to us, we will come to the mark. And so, of course, they saw the Western brothers, they were rich and had all this wealth, and they wanted to have the same standards immediately, which was a big mistake at the time. Because, I mean, I think there were other plans of having Eastern Germany being like something, a special economic zone or something like that. But they turned it down, and the people from the bottom said, if the mark doesn't come to us, we will come to the mark, and we will just migrate to the west.
I'm not going to ask about German history, so if that topic's still going on, please continue. What I wanted to ask Sean was, first of all, thanks for bringing the dialogue about class theory here. Second, in your experience, having discussions like this and in other places, I knew you were doing this in Badrum or somewhere earlier this year, what has been your experience in reaction from libertarians and from others in introducing a class theory to libertarianism? And second, what strategies have you found to be the most useful or the most persuasive in presenting it?
Oh, with libertarians, you just say what you think, and if you're talking nonsense, they'll tell you, and if they agree, they'll agree. What reactions do I get?
I should have said among the general public rather than among libertarians.
Oh, I'll try to pass on that question.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, well, you can answer.
Fine, I had 2 questions and that's
However,
3. That's
let me answer the first one. What reaction do I get among other libertarians? Some libertarians will say, yeah, I know that. So what? So what? That was from a friend called Christian Michel, who goes much further than I do. Other libertarians scandalised. I deliberately shocked them by using Marxist terminology, discourse, hegemony, class consciousness, dialectical, and so on. Of course, libertarians have been part of the movement for nearly 100 years. Or it's like a tug of war. On the one side, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals. On the other side, Marxists and various other socialists, pulling, pulling, pulling. And our side has been against the Marxists. And so to start using their language seems a bit like treason. And some libertarians are just not happy with it. They don't like it. Not because the ideas are wrong, but because the whole thing sounds deeply suspicious. Other libertarians don't like it because they argue, often quite validly, that modern societies are so large and wealthy and diverse that you cannot legitimately talk about a single ruling class. What you have, perhaps, is various gangs of people all trying to get their hands on the state for their particular purposes, and these people cannot be regarded as a single ruling class. Now, I do think that the concept of a ruling class is useful. It's useful because it's true, and it's also useful because it helps us to shape our propaganda outreach. Now, you asked what reaction I got from ordinary people. Well, the answer.
Well, and which strategies in introducing the concept have been most persuasive?
Well, I've asked that question quite easily. I've never tried.
Oh.
No, I've never gone among ordinary people arguing about the ruling class. Sometimes I've gone on the radio and spoken about it, but you don't get much feedback from that. What do you think?
I was just going to footnote something that you said about the ruling class and introducing this dialogue. And one thing that occurred to me when you were speaking was that this is the type of conversation which can help indicate to people where they have actually the ruling class in their own minds. And when people are challenged to look at what privileges they are exploiting that come from illegitimate state power, suddenly there can be a conflict set up within the listener's own mind, and this can be quite liberating.
Yes.
On a one-to-one basis.
And I will try it. Let me ask a question here.
Who is a member of the group? That's the best one.
Oh, no, it's very difficult. I mean,
Yeah,
I was
that's the hard one.
to be honest, I'd love to be a member of the ruling class. I wouldn't have to work so hard. But, I mean, what are your thoughts on the idea of the ruling class? Is it that I've come here and you know all of this because you've read Kevin Carson and Roderick Long, and you've read Popper, and you know perfectly well there's a ruling class, and you're just being very polite because you've heard all this before 100 times, and that's it? Or is it something that is reasonably new to you?
Well, to me it sounded a little bit suspicious as I have seen the name of the lecture, because I knew that ruling class is a Marxist term, but it has its logic, and I think there is a lot of plausibility. But it is new for me.
Right. Okay. Well, the last thing I'd say, really, I mean, I don't want to take the whole evening because there's so many people here with interesting things to say about it. But the last thing I'd say is that for any ideology to become dominant, it must have what's called a purchase on reality. It must say certain things which people regard as true, and which probably are true. Now, the reason why Marxism has such a purchase on reality is that it did explain that there are certain people who derive income and status from unearned opportunities. There are people at the top and people at the bottom, and this is an unjust system. Now, everything else about Marxism was false, and there are mountains of dead bodies. They're still digging bodies up in Russia because of this ideology. Marxism, as a total ideology, was false, but it did have one purchase on reality, which is the idea that there is a ruling class. This ruling class is illegitimate, and there is a better system available. And so those parts of Marxism which are true, we should be quite prepared to take for ourselves. And indeed, we're not taking them, we're taking them back, because most early class theory that Marx drew from was liberal class theory. And now you can look at any ideology which has dominated any time, and there's always some purchase on reality.
With it, I blurted.
Okay. Well, and what about the ruling class in an anarcho-capitalistic society? I mean, wouldn't there evolve one? For example, owners of private bank companies who will print their own private currencies, or providers of private security. I think that in the concept of anarcho-capitalistic society, there is a lot of place for some tendencies to establish a ruling class of its own. I mean, because I see there that in the roots, it is a psychological problem. Hayek analyzed as one of the sources of anti-capitalism the fact that people do not like change in their life, and capitalism brings with it this constant need of adapting to the changing market conditions, and therefore the natural tendency of people is to find for them some safe place where you can earn your money and you can plan, and you have not to change, not to adapt, where you feel comfortable and safe. So to me, it seems like a natural tendency which is somehow carved into the heart of man, or in the psychology of man. And how could we avoid some involvement of a ruling class in an anarcho-capitalistic society?
Okay. If the state were to collapse today, another state would emerge tomorrow. The state is not a thing, the state is an idea in people's minds. And you cannot destroy an idea by destroying things. Even if most people were to accept the state is a bad thing, an anarchist society here at the moment would not last very long, because there are always excuses for setting up a state. So, just after the end of the Cold War, the American ruling class was looking for a new legitimizing ideology, and for a few years, the newspapers, The Economist in particular, was filled with stories about giant asteroids and how they might crash into the Earth, and so it needs to keep up.
Those are still coming, those asteroids. They're out there.
I know. You could see the money behind the panic in the early 1990s. Unless you heard an enormous military able to fire rockets at these asteroids, they might crash into the Earth. Now, the justifications for states and state activities, they come all the time. And if we manage to abolish the state in this generation, there'll be another state in the next generation. The only way in which we can be sure that we live in a free society that will endure is if there's some way of getting away from it. If we can get ourselves out of reach of these people. And it's only when we discover another America to which people can run away that, yes, well, I'm afraid the Americas which we could run away have been abolished.
If we can find this within our own minds and within our own communities, within our own neighborhoods.
If we can find somewhere to run away from, then yes, there'll be a free society. In the meantime, it's a holding action. We're trying to slow down the drift into some rather unpleasant total society. But we're a very lucky species. We've been around for a long time, and we've had Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great and Stalin and Hitler and all the others. But despite that, There are more of us than ever before. We're richer than ever before. We're living longer than ever before. We have so many new and shiny toys. Things are broadly moving in the right direction, not as quick as they could, not as quick as we'd like. We just need to hope that things will continue moving in that direction until a new America appears and enough of us can threaten to run away for the structural state power to collapse or at least to weaken. In the meantime, we're fighting and hoping.
I have one more question, because you asked about whether the term ruling class is familiar and if we already heard about those things. I think one term that has not been mentioned but is very common right now is the term establishment, the establishment. And I think it has become very popular, especially in the blogosphere and right now, to criticize the establishment, especially in connection with all the things that's going on in the financial markets, let's say Goldman Sachs, etc., or people owning media. So I was a bit surprised about you using the term ruling class, and my question now is, how do you see it in terms of terminology? The establishment, is it the same as the ruling class? Is there a difference? Or what is the establishment?
Okay, the establishment is a term made up in England in about 1957 to describe the structures of power within English society. And it is a very attractive term. The establishment, it doesn't sound very threatening, and the establishment, well, you have, in English terms, you have the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the chief rabbi, you have the managing director of Marks and Spencer, probably the captain of the England football team and so on. They're all part of this big establishment that somehow hangs together and makes the country what it is. I have sometimes used the word establishment. The problem is that, well, the nice thing about the middle class is that it's much harder, much more propagandistic term.
Much more focused on individuals rather than systems, I think.
Yes. We must smash the establishment. It doesn't sound quite the same as we must smash the ruling class.
But for some things you describe, let's say the term ruling, it implies that there are actually people who rule. But when you talk about people, let's say in the media or academia, the term establishment, I think, would be much more appropriate, because people in academia, they actually don't rule. So, but when you say they're part of the establishment because the ideas they promote are established, or so that's all.
Okay. The advantage of the word establishment is that it may often be more accurate in the sociological sense. The advantage of the phrase working class is that there is already a body of ruling class analysis which we can turn to our own purposes, and it has a footprint in the human mind that is quite useful for us. We can argue against the ruling class and fit ourselves into a tradition that has now been vacated by the radical socialists. We're using their weapons. If it were 200 years ago, would we use the word ruling class? No. William Cobbett, an English Tory radical, used to preach against what's called the thing, which means much the same as establishment. So my objection to the word establishment is that it sounds cozy and unthreatening. In English terms, the establishment is the moderator of the Free Church of Scotland. It is the captain of the England cricket team. It can mean anyone who is of moderate importance, whereas ruling class means people who oppress and steal. It does describe a reality. Establishment describes a reality. It's simply a question of propaganda.
Propaganda is important.
And propaganda is important. You see, if you were to sit down with a person of average intelligence who had never been exposed to libertarian ideas, and if you had 6 months of that person's undivided attention, you might create another libertarian, but you're not likely to do that. What you might get is 5 minutes on the radio or 5 minutes in front of a crowd. And if you shout against the ruling class, you're likely to get your message across.
And this is where the Marxist evangelists were so successful around the world, is in going out and using language in ways that weren't necessarily logically persuasive, but that motivated lots of people to get together and say, what can we do?
Yeah. And we can learn from our enemies. We can learn from the Christian evangelists. They have very effective ways of bringing people over. And the Marxists in their day, they have very effective ways of bringing people over. And Islamic radical evangelists in mosques up and down England, they have very effective ways of bringing people over. And it may be that you don't like the ideologies I've talked about, but the weapons used by those people are worth studying because they are effective. And we don't just want to be right, we also want to win.
My next
question.
In every given group there is something so-called natural elite. And what's the relation between these two concepts, ruling class and natural elite? Is that meant as the same, are they different?
Yes. Now, quite often you'll find that a ruling class is made up not simply of parasites, it's also made up of very intelligent and effective people. Sometimes a ruling class will be made up of completely useless people. The Russian ruling class before 1917 appears to have been pretty useless. The French ruling class before 1789 appears to be largely useless. We know that because they collapsed so easily. But you'll find, so the ruling class in Czechoslovakia before 1989 was pretty incompetent. It survived because of those, how many, 120,000 Soviet troops in this country, wasn't it? 500,000. Okay. The reason why the Czechoslovak ruling class was able to stay in charge was because of those 500,000 Soviet troops. The moment Gorbachev said, they're going home, that was the end of the system. However, you will often find in modern England, in modern America, modern Germany, and maybe modern Slovakia, that the ruling class contains the most intelligent and the most efficient people in the society. And that is a problem. It needs to be faced. It would be nice if the ruling class we were facing was filled with the kind of people who were so easily pushed out in 1917 and in 1789. But that doesn't happen very often. These people often need a very hard kick before they move anywhere at all.
Who are they really pushed out by? Who are they?
Well, good question.
Well, in Russia in 1917?
Oh, that's easy to answer.
Bullets to the heads, I believe.
Yes. Pushing them out now. Well, the question is, will they be replaced? And if the answer is yes, they will be replaced, perhaps it is a better strategy to focus on those people and try to humanize them. It depends on circumstances.
Who should be the target of our persuasion? Should it be the crowds upon which the propaganda will work? But I think that if you want to persuade the ruling class, you should use more like intellectual debate rather than propaganda.
Right. Look, if you are an Islamic or a Christian evangelist, you will change society from the bottom up. You will go out preaching in the marketplace, and you will get ordinary people on your side. If you're a political radical, it's probably a better idea to address your propaganda to members of the intellectual elite. It's simply a matter of time. Look, if you are a Christian or an Islamic evangelist, you will do this full time You'll live more than full-time, you'll have no family, you'll have no career, you'll have no private life. You are doing this because God wants it, and you will find your reward in heaven. And so you can go out and you can concentrate on poor and stupid people and bring over enough of them to make a difference. But the point is, most of you have private lives, you have jobs, you have families, and you do not want to spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, preaching libertarianism. And so we must face facts as they are. If you are to have any influence at all, you have to focus on the intellectual elites, because you will not need to spend your entire life doing it.
So would propaganda work around the ruling class?
Right.
Because from definition I would say that propaganda is something that is kind of something for discussion, and that you take it only if you don't think at all.
No, propaganda is much more sophisticated than that. Propaganda works at many levels. The difference between propaganda and persuasive argument is not very clear. They shade into each other. At the bottom, you have all power to the Soviets. At the top, you have a set of very sophisticated arguments about the location of class power. You use the means that are available to you and that are most likely to you. And you are the only person who can know what those are. Well? This meeting may have been a total waste of time, and 6 months' time no longer remember, and 5 people watch the video on the internet. Or it may be that one of you starts thinking about it, and you do something that you would not otherwise have done. Or it's possible that you'll think I'm mad, and you'll go and talk to your neighbour and say, I was this complete lunatic last night for England, he said this, and your neighbour will think, oh, that sounds interesting, and something will happen. We don't know what works, we don't know what will be the effect of our actions. Most of our efforts will be wasted, but the problem is we don't know which efforts will be wasted, so we just have to carry on. As I said, you are the experts on how to change things in Slovakia. I can't say I'm even an expert on how to change things in English, because I have notoriously failed in the past 30 years to have any influence whatever. Perhaps in the next 30 years I'll do better.
Let's hope for black swan.
Yes. Okay.
Isn't that kind of proof that you are too dangerous for the ruling class? Their ownership of the media, I quoted you actually. So aren't they using the tool against you?
To some extent I've been kept out of the mainstream media, but on my way here I was telephoned by an English television company which wanted an interview with me at 7 o'clock, and I turned it down. I'm on the radio quite often. I don't do the big BBC television program watched by 20 million people, so I could complain I'm kept out of that, but I'm kept very busy. Oddly enough, the British state media, the BBC, the state-owned media giant in England, is much more friendly to me than the private newspapers. The BBC always wants me. 3 or 4 times a week sometimes. Strange.
I have a question regarding the goal of weakening the state and the ruling class on one side, and then the need for free society to have a guarantee of fair trial. So, case the state will be replaced by something else. Is it all will be the guarantee of fair trial?
No guarantees. Try.
May I come back to the discussion of how to promote promote our ideas in the best way. Well, as you mentioned, the difference between a political agitator and a religious preacher, I think the difference is that if you are trying to bring to people some religious ideas, you are touching them in a very existentialist way. I mean, you are trying to, you are reaching some of their deepest emotions, etc. But as a libertarian, you are just trying to attract rationalistic ideas. I mean, libertarianism is a rationalistic doctrine, and I think that man is, in the first instance, an emotional being. I mean, you could send a copy of Rothbard's Man, Economy and State to everyone, family in Slovakia, but the big question is, who of them would read it? Who of them who would read it would also understand the arguments? And who of them who would read it and understand the arguments would also say yes to the arguments? So isn't the problem why libertarianism is such a minority, such a thing of minority? Is it not in it that what is the reason not the isn't the reason that it is a purely rationalistic doctrine which is incapable of touching the emotions of man?
Yes, in the way that it's often promoted, but what does libertarian offer? It offers a better life for you and your children. Now, you know, that's surely an emotional appeal. I think the problem that we've often had is that we have offered libertarianism to people like ourselves. You know, what does libertarian offer you? It means that you can smoke some cannabis without worrying about the police. It means you don't need to worry about keeping tax records because there are no taxes. It means that you can drive around as you like. What does libertarian offer people at the bottom? The people who gathered in SMP Square back in 1989 and who are rather dubious about the legal equality of all forms of property. What does it offer them? It offers them a better life for themselves and their children, because it offers them the ability to control their own lives in ways that currently are not possible. At the moment in this country and in England, but in most countries, ordinary people have they have a choice. You get a job working as a checkout assistant in Tesco, or you can go on the dole, or you can get some really awful little job at the bottom. And you won't earn enough to pay high taxes, so if you offer ordinary people lower tax or no taxes, but they don't actually, it doesn't mean anything. If you offer people, if you offer these people less state activity, they might not see that they gain from it, because they see the benefits they receive, all those pensions, minimum wages, welfare benefits, healthcare and so on. They see those benefits. They don't see the costs involved, and in many cases they don't pay the costs in financial terms. So offering lower taxes to people is not the way to run libertarianism. You need to explain to people how their lives could be transformed in a free society. As I said, at the moment, most ordinary people have a choice between crap jobs at the bottom and various forms of state welfare. Well, in a free society, what you could do is just go and dig your garden. You could grow your own food. You might need to get a job to pay for a few bills here and there, but you would not be dependent on the